Jonathan Harker never imagined that one simple business trip could feel like stepping off the very edge of the world. He left London with the calm confidence of a young man who believed he understood how life worked, and who trusted that every road, no matter how far, would eventually lead him home. But as the train pushed deeper into the mountains of Eastern Europe, he began to feel a slow tightening in his chest, a quiet pressure he could not name, yet could not shake. Outside the window, the world changed mile after mile. Villages grew smaller, chimneys stopped smoking, and the forests thickened until the trees seemed to lean in, whispering to one another above the train roof. The air felt older, heavier, as if it carried 1,000 unspoken stories. People on the train spoke less the higher they climbed, and when they did, whisper. Their voices held the tremble of people who had learned to respect the dark. At the final station, a small crowd gathered around Jonathan. They looked at him with a mix of curiosity, worry, and something close to pity. When he mentioned the name Count Dracula, silence fell like a blanket. An old woman grabbed his arm and pressed a worn rosary into his palm. She begged him, almost in tears, not to go. A man carrying firewood crossed himself the moment Jonathan repeated the Count's name. Jonathan tried to laugh politely, but even he heard the strain in his own voice. The carriage arrived long after sunset, pulled by 2 black horses whose eyes reflected the torchlight in a way that made Jonathan's stomach twist. The driver never spoke a word. He simply pointed at the carriage door. Jonathan stepped in, and the moment the door slammed shut behind him, he felt the mountains swallow his last sense of safety. The road twisted through the forest like a wound. Branches brushed the windows, soft at first, then harsher, like fingers testing the glass. The moon hid behind thick clouds, and the air turned cold enough to sting. Jonathan felt every bump in the road as if the earth itself was warning him to turn back. The wind did not howl. It whispered, quiet, intentional, as if it knew his name. He closed his eyes and pictured Mina waiting for him back in London. Her smile had always been enough to steady him, but even that warm memory felt small out here, swallowed by the immensity of the mountains and the shadows between the trees. When the castle finally appeared on the ridge, Jonathan felt his breath catch. It stood like a black shape carved out of the sky, tall and silent, as if it had been watching him long before he ever arrived. No lights in the windows, no sound, just the sense of something ancient waiting behind its walls. The carriage stopped. The doors creaked open, and Jonathan realized with a cold clarity that every warning he heard was not superstition, but instinct, pure human instinct, the kind that whispers when danger is near. He stepped forward because he had no choice. Behind him was darkness too deep to return to. Ahead of him was a world too strange to trust. He told himself everything would be fine, but the echo in his chest answered differently. He was no longer a traveler, not anymore. He was crossing a line that once crossed could never be undone. Jonathan stood before the great doors of the castle with the uneasy sense that he had stepped onto the threshold of another world. When the doors slowly opened, the dim torchlight revealed a man with sharp features and eyes as deep as an endless abyss. Count Dracula welcomed him with a polite smile, yet there was something inside that smile that made Jonathan's skin tighten with dread. The Count's voice was low and steady, every word chosen with care. He gestured for Jonathan to enter, moving with the calm confidence of a gracious host, though underneath it all, Jonathan sensed the quiet precision of a predator guiding its prey deeper into the den. The castle was enormous, so vast that their footsteps echoed endlessly through long hallways that seemed carved out of cold stone and silence. Very quickly, Jonathan noticed something unsettling. There were no servants, no voices, no sound of life anywhere except their own. The chairs, the tables, even the drapes carried a thin layer of dust, as if no human hand had touched them for years. The air drifted through the corridors like a breath from an ancient tomb. Yet Dracula spoke as though everything were perfectly normal. He asked about London, about Jonathan's work, about Mina, about the modern world he claimed he longed to understand. His questions were smooth and polite, but his eyes told a different story. There was no warmth in them, no curiosity, only calculation, as if he were studying every movement Jonathan made, not like a man watching a guest, but like a hunter observing a rare animal. Dinner was served, but another chill washed over Jonathan. Dracula did not eat. He did not drink. He simply watched, his long, pale hands folded on the table, his dark eyes fixed on Jonathan with a focus so sharp it felt like a blade. Jonathan tried to shake off the discomfort. He asked why no servants were present. Dracula answered with a quiet smile that he preferred solitude, that people only distracted him. For reasons he could not explain, that answer made Jonathan colder than the wind outside. Later, as Dracula showed him to his room, Jonathan discovered that every door along the hallway was locked. Not just locked, but locked from the outside. He tried to convince himself it was simply a local custom, but the truth tightened around him like a rope. He felt watched, measured, contained. That night, the wind outside the window howled like someone sighing in the dark. Jonathan could not sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the Count's pale face and that too perfect smile, a smile that hid something ancient and hungry. He missed Mina. He missed safety. He missed the simple comfort of knowing the people around him were human. Here, inside this lonely castle on a mountain ridge, Jonathan understood something with sudden clarity. Dracula was not merely the owner of this place. He was the master of its shadows, and those shadows seemed alive, waiting, creeping ever closer through the stone walls as Jonathan lay awake, with fear rising quietly in his chest. He realized he was no longer a guest. He was something else entirely. That night inside the castle, Jonathan woke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural. There was no wind, no shifting of doors, no sign of life anywhere. Only the cold glow of moonlight slipping through the small window, drawing long silver lines across the stone floor. He felt as if someone was calling to him, not with words, but with a soft pull, gentle and tempting, like a voice drifting inside his mind. Jonathan opened his door and stepped into the long hallway. The air wrapped around him with a strange chill, almost like an invisible hand guiding him forward. He did not understand why he kept walking, yet each step felt less like a choice and more like something pulling him toward the far end of the hall, where the moonlight shone brightest. When he entered a large chamber, Jonathan froze. On a velvet-covered bed lay 3 women he had never seen before. They were beautiful in a way that made his pulse slow and his breath deepen. Their faces delicate, their lips red, their skin glowing softly under the moon. Every movement they made was slow, fluid, as if they were drifting inside water. Jonathan knew he should turn away. He knew stepping closer was wrong, but their eyes held him. One of the women moved toward him, placed a cold hand on his cheek, and Jonathan felt a shiver run down his back. It was frightening, yet something inside him leaned closer. Her breath brushed against his neck. His heart pounded hard, part fear, part something else he dared not name. Then a shadow entered the room. Jonathan did not need to look twice. Dracula was there. He was silent, but the fury inside his eyes was like a storm locked behind stone walls. Without effort, he swept the women aside, as if they were children playing where they should not. He looked at Jonathan with a coldness so sharp it felt like a blade pressed to the bone. Jonathan understood instantly. Dracula had saved him, but not out of mercy. He had saved him because Jonathan belonged to him, not as a guest, not as a friend, but as property, as prey not yet ready to be taken. Dracula sent the women away. They melted into the shadows, leaving behind a sweet scent that only made Jonathan feel more confused, more shaken. When the heavy door slammed shut, Jonathan realized the truth. The thing that terrified him most was not the danger. It was the fact that he had been tempted, that for a moment, under the moonlight, and those soft, unspoken invitations, something inside him had started to give in, and Dracula had seen all of it. Jonathan knew he was trapped in a game where even his own soul was no longer safe in his hands. He had stepped too far into the darkness, and the darkness had started to like him. While Jonathan fought for his sanity in a distant land, Mina found comfort in the presence of her dearest friend, Lucy Westenra. Lucy carried a warmth that made people feel safe the moment she smiled. Her laughter was soft, her heart was gentle, and in the peaceful seaside town of Whitby, she seemed untouched by any shadow. But as summer faded, something inside her began to change. At first it was small, a tired look in her eyes, a heaviness in her breath. Mina thought it was simply the weather or the stress of planning for her future. Lucy was engaged, loved, and surrounded by people who adored her, yet she looked like someone drifting farther away each day. Then the sleepwalking began. Mina would wake in the night to find Lucy gone from her bed, standing outside on the cliff path, her white nightgown glowing under the moonlight. She looked beautiful, almost heavenly, yet there was something haunting in the way she stared into the darkness, as if someone was calling her. Mina would wrap her arms around her and lead her back inside, whispering that everything would be all right. But she felt Lucy trembling. She felt the cold on her skin, a deep cold that did not belong to the night air. Each morning Lucy grew paler. Her lips lost their color. Her hands turned cold. Mina wrote in her diary that she felt as if her friend was fading, little by little, like the sea pulling sand from under her feet. The doctors could not explain it. They spoke of nerves, exhaustion, fragile health. But Mina sensed something else, something she could not name, yet felt in her bones. One night, while brushing Lucy's hair, Mina lifted the collar of her gown and gasped. There were 2 small marks on Lucy's neck, tiny, almost invisible. But the sight of them sent a chill down Mina's spine. Lucy looked at her reflection in the mirror and whispered that she felt watched at night, as if someone was standing just outside her window. She tried to smile it off. She tried to be brave. But fear lived in her eyes, and Mina, holding Lucy's trembling hands, realized a terrible truth. Her friend, the gentle girl who once glowed like morning sunlight, was now walking a fragile line between the world of the living and a darkness she did not understand. Lucy was still an angel, but an angel whose wings were slowly being touched by the night. Out on the open sea, far from the safety of any shore, the crew of the Demeter began their journey with the simple hope of a safe delivery and a fair wage. They were strong men, familiar with storms, with salt in their hair, and years of hard work carved into their hands. But none of them were prepared for what waited inside the cargo hold. The first nights were calm. The waves were gentle, the sky clear. Yet even in that calm, a strange feeling settled over the ship, a heaviness the men could not explain. The captain wrote in his log that the crew whispered of an unseen presence, something cold that moved through the lower decks when the lanterns burned low. Then the disappearances began. One man vanished during the night watch. His lantern was found rolling across the deck, the flame still burning, but he was gone. Another man swore he saw a tall figure slipping between the crates in the cargo hold, silent and fast, like a shadow that had learned how to breathe. The men searched every corner of the ship, calling the missing sailors by name, but the only answer was the sound of the waves hitting the hull. Fear settled into their bones. Sleep became a luxury they no longer trusted. They took turns guarding the doors, clutching their knives, their eyes darting toward every shape the moonlight cast on the wood. Each morning, one less man stood among them. Some disappeared quietly. Others screamed before the night swallowed their voices. The captain tried to keep order. He prayed, he commanded, he shouted. But terror made the crew wild. Men begged him to turn the ship around, to abandon the cargo, to find any harbor. The captain refused. Duty was all he had left, and maybe, deep down, pride. But on the final night, when even the bravest sailor trembled with fear, the crew witnessed something that broke whatever courage they had left. A massive black shape stood on the deck in the lightning flashes, tall and rigid, with eyes that glowed faintly in the storm. It watched them, not with anger, not with hunger, but with ownership, as if they were already his. By sunrise, the Demeter drifted into the harbor alone. No voices, no footsteps, no living soul. Only the captain, tied to the wheel, his hands frozen in place, his eyes still open as if he died staring into the face of something he could not fight. The people on shore felt a cold wind move through them as they looked upon the empty ship. They did not know it yet, but the darkness they sensed had already stepped onto their land, and it had come to stay. Lucy's condition worsened with each passing day, and the people who loved her felt the fear tightening around them like an invisible net. Mina held her hand every morning, hoping to feel warmth, but Lucy's skin grew colder, softer, almost fragile, as if something precious inside her was slipping away. She tried to smile for Mina, tried to joke the way she always had, but her voice was faint, drifting in and out like a candle flame fighting against the wind. When Dr. Seward first saw Lucy, he felt a chill he could not explain. He had known her as a bright-spirited young woman, full of life and light. Yet now she lay pale on the pillows, breathing shallowly, her lips drained of color. He brought his mentor, Professor Van Helsing, a man whose knowledge of the world reached far beyond ordinary medicine. The moment Van Helsing looked at Lucy, he understood that he was facing something ancient, something no textbook could explain. He asked for no explanations. He simply took Lucy's hand, whispered a prayer, and turned to Mina with a seriousness that made her heart tremble. He told her Lucy must never be left alone at night, not for a moment, and they guarded her with desperation. Arthur Holmwood, the man who loved Lucy more than his own breath, spent nights at her bedside, watching her chest rise and fall in fragile rhythms. He would hold her close whenever she shivered, brushing stray hair from her forehead, whispering that he was there, that she was safe, even though he no longer believed it himself. But each night, something seemed to call her. Lucy would slip into a restless sleep, her fingers twitching, her lips whispering words no one could understand. Sometimes she would try to stand. Sometimes she would drift toward the window, as if someone outside was waiting for her. Mina often woke first and would rush to hold her back, terrified of what might happen if Lucy crossed that threshold. Then came the night when her breathing turned ragged, and Van Helsing ordered blood transfusions. Arthur gave his blood first, without hesitation. Dr. Seward followed. Then Quincy Morris, the loyal friend who would do anything to save her. Each man grew weak afterward, but they never complained. They would have given every drop if it meant saving Lucy's life. For a short while she improved. Her cheeks warmed, her eyes opened. She looked like herself again, fragile but present. And Arthur cried when she whispered his name with a faint smile. But the relief was brief. The next night she grew pale again, even weaker than before. Van Helsing found the window open, and the marks on her neck darkened. It felt like a cruel pattern. They fought to give her life, and something in the shadows came each night to take it back. Van Helsing placed garlic flowers around her room, around her bed, around her neck. He lit candles and prayed under his breath. But deep down he knew that they were not fighting an illness. They were fighting a presence, a will, a hunger. And he feared they were losing. On the final night, Lucy whispered something that broke Mina's heart. She said she felt someone calling her from beyond the darkness, someone she could not resist. Tears filled Mina's eyes as she begged her friend not to listen, not to drift toward that voice. But Lucy only looked at her with a sad and distant tenderness, as if she already knew she was slipping away. In that moment, everyone in the room sensed the terrible truth. They were no longer fighting to save Lucy's body. They were fighting to save her soul. And the night outside was growing stronger. Lucy's funeral was quiet, filled with the kind of sorrow that sits heavy on a chest and refuses to lift. Arthur stood beside her coffin with empty eyes, holding on to the hope that she had finally found peace. Mina cried silently, feeling as if she had lost a sister. Even Dr. Seward, a man trained to face tragedy, struggled to breathe as the coffin lowered into the cold earth. For a moment, it seemed like the darkness had ended, but the peace was an illusion. Within days, strange whispers spread through the town. Children spoke of a beautiful lady who called to them at night, her voice soft and sweet, her smile warm, her arms open. They said she walked by a cemetery, her dress glowing in the moonlight, her hair floating as if carried by a gentle wind. Van Helsing felt the truth before anyone said a word. There was no rest in Lucy's grave. One night he took Dr. Seward and Arthur to the cemetery. The air was cold, the moon hung low, and when they opened the tomb, Arthur fell to his knees. The coffin was empty. No sign of Lucy, no sign of her peaceful rest. Before Arthur could speak, a soft rustling came from the trees. They turned and saw her, Lucy, or at least the shape that once belonged to her. She was beautiful in a way that felt wrong, a glow too cold to be human. Her lips were red, her eyes bright and sharp. She held a small child in her arms, comforting it with a voice that sounded almost angelic. Arthur reached for her, tears falling down his face. She stepped closer, smiling softly, but there was hunger behind that smile, a hunger that made Van Helsing raise the crucifix with shaking hands. Lucy hissed, her face twisting into something wild, something wounded, something desperate. The child slipped from her arms and ran. Lucy backed away, caught between wanting Arthur and fearing the light he carried. The moment she vanished into the shadows, Arthur's heart broke. He understood. The woman he loved was gone. What remained was something shaped by darkness, something trapped, something suffering. Van Helsing placed a hand on his shoulder. His voice was quiet, steady, full of human sorrow. He told Arthur that the only way to free her was to face one final act of courage, one final act of love. They returned to the tomb at dawn. Lucy lay inside now, still and silent, her face peaceful, as if waiting. Arthur's hand shook as he picked up the stake. His tears fell onto her cold skin. He whispered that he was sorry. He whispered that he loved her. And with a trembling breath, he did what he had to do. The cry that left her lips was a mix of pain and release, fading into silence. When it was done, Lucy's face softened, truly softened. She looked like herself again, gentle, warm, human, and Arthur knew that the darkness no longer held her. He had given her back her soul. After laying Lucy to rest for the final time, the world felt heavier for everyone who loved her. The grief was real, but so was the rage. Something had taken Lucy from them. Something had used her innocence, stolen her warmth, twisted her gentle soul, and left her family broken. And now they could no longer pretend it was a sickness. They knew its name, Dracula. Jonathan returned to London pale and shaken, carrying the scars of a man who had seen too much darkness in too little time. When he told Mina everything he had witnessed in the castle, his voice trembled. But Mina listened without fear. She touched his hand and whispered that they would face it together, that no shadow was too deep when two hearts stood as one. Professor Van Helsing gathered them all in one room. Jonathan, Mina, Arthur, Dr. Seward, Quincy Morris, 5 people bound by tragedy and love, 5 people who had lost someone or nearly lost themselves, 5 people who were ready to fight back. Van Helsing laid out every diary, every letter, every newspaper clipping, even Jonathan's frightened notes from his time in Transylvania. He called it their living evidence, their record of a nightmare that had stepped into the real world. Mina offered to organize everything. She had always been careful, thoughtful, steady. She typed each page with trembling fingers, shaping a single story from all their voices. Her grief for Lucy fueled her determination. Each word she typed became a promise that darkness would not win without a fight. Jonathan stayed by her side, watching her strength with awe. She had suffered too, yet she still stood tall, still believed in light, still believed in good. He realized then that Mina was not just his wife. She was the heart of their group, the one who held them together, the one who refused to let despair swallow them whole. As they studied every detail, a disturbing pattern appeared. Dracula had prepared for this. He had bought multiple houses across London. He had moved silently through the fog-covered streets. He had created hiding places filled with the earth from his homeland, places where he could rest and regain his strength. They understood then that they were not hunting a monster wandering blindly. They were hunting a mind, a plan, a predator who had already slipped into the heart of their city. But despite the fear pressing on their chests, something stronger rose among them. Resolve, a shared purpose, a fire they could not ignore. They had lost Lucy. They refused to lose anyone else. And together, in that small room filled with papers and grief and hope, the group made a silent vow. The hunt had begun. The darkness had chosen its battlefield, and they would meet it there. Mina had always been the quiet strength of the group, the steady voice that pulled everyone back from fear, the one who held the scattered pieces of their lives together. She carried grief for Lucy, worry for Jonathan, and the weight of every story they uncovered about Dracula. Yet she never let her voice shake. But darkness has a way of sensing light, and the stronger Mina became, the more she drew the attention of the one enemy they feared above all. Dracula had lost his hiding places, his servants, and the quiet anonymity he once enjoyed in London. He knew who hunted him. He knew who had gathered every diary and every letter. He knew who had stitched all the clues into a map that pointed directly to him, and he knew exactly where to strike. One night, when the fog lay thick outside their window and Mina sat typing at the small desk by the fire, fighting exhaustion but refusing to stop, Jonathan fell asleep beside her. He had been awake for days, watching over her, terrified that Dracula might come. But fatigue caught him, and the room fell silent except for the soft tapping of Mina's typewriter. She did not hear the window unlatch. She did not hear the slow breath behind her. She only felt a sudden coldness at her neck, a chill like winter air entering her bones. Then she saw him, tall, pale, his eyes glowing with a hunger she had never seen in any human face. Dracula stood in her room like a nightmare that had found its way into the waking world. Mina tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. He moved with a terrible calm, placing his hand on her shoulder, his grip gentle yet impossible to resist. Jonathan woke to a sound of her gasp, but Dracula was faster. He placed her head against his chest and whispered words Jonathan could not understand, words that made Mina's eyes glaze with fear and confusion. Jonathan lunged toward them, but Dracula lifted a hand and held him back with a force that felt inhuman. He watched with helpless horror as Dracula lowered Mina into his embrace, as if performing a dark and twisted ritual. Then came the moment that shattered Jonathan's soul. Dracula opened a small cut on his own chest and pressed Mina's lips to it. She struggled, weak and terrified, but Dracula held her firmly. Mina drank his blood, and her cry was a broken sound, a sound filled with shame and helpless fear. Jonathan collapsed to the floor, screaming her name. But the ritual had already begun. Dracula held her like a grotesque lover, his voice deep with triumph, and whispered that she now belonged to him, that her mind, her dreams, and her very soul would carry his shadow. When Van Helsing and the others burst into the room, Dracula vanished in a swirl of cold air, leaving Mina trembling on the bed, shaking as if her soul had been torn open. Her eyes were filled with tears, but worse than fear was the shame she felt. She begged Jonathan to forgive her, even though she had done nothing wrong. Jonathan held her tightly, his voice breaking, as he promised that none of this was her fault. But everyone in the room knew the terrible truth. Mina was marked. Dracula had created a bond with her, a spiritual chain that allowed him to whisper into her dreams, to invade her thoughts, to feel her heartbeat as if it were his own. Van Helsing placed his hands gently on Mina's shoulders and told her with a fatherly tenderness that she was not lost, that as long as she still fought inside, there was hope. But his eyes revealed the fear he tried to hide. Dracula had chosen her not out of chance, but out of strategy. She was their guide, their heart, their source of unity and clarity. If he could corrupt her, he could break all of them. From that night on, Mina was no longer just a friend to protect. She was the battleground where light and darkness would decide their final war. And every second mattered, because Dracula was no longer hunting from the shadows. He had made his move. He had marked his target. And that target was Mina. The moment Dracula escaped into the night, the world around Mina changed. She felt him in her dreams, in the silence between her breaths, in a distant echo of her heartbeat. Sometimes she woke shaking, whispering that he was near. Other times she pressed her hands to her temples, fighting visions of dark rivers and snowy mountains that were not hers, but his. Van Helsing realized what she was experiencing. Dracula had bound his mind to hers. Through that connection, he could hide, travel, or strike, and Mina felt pieces of it like shadows passing inside her soul. Instead of breaking them, it gave them their first real weapon. Mina could sense him. Not clearly, not always, but enough for Van Helsing to build a plan. They would chase him, city to city, river to river, across the continent if they had to. They would cut him off before he reached the land that gave him power. And they would end this before he fully consumed Mina's spirit. Jonathan held her as she trembled through each vision. He kissed her forehead, whispering that she was stronger than the darkness inside her. She looked at him through tears, afraid to sleep, afraid to dream, afraid of what she might reveal to Dracula without meaning to. But she stayed brave, braver than any of them. Their chase began at dawn. Jonathan and Arthur searched the docks for ships leaving London. Quincy Morris followed the trains, tracking cargo manifests without rest. Dr. Seward gathered witness accounts, piecing together every sighting of large wooden crates filled with dark earth. Van Helsing stayed by Mina's side, guiding her through visions with the gentle patience of a father, writing down every detail that trembled on her lips. Her voice was weak but determined each time she described snowy peaks, narrow passes, frozen rivers, and the rumble of wagon wheels on rough stone. They knew where Dracula was headed, home, to the castle where he first trapped Jonathan, to the land where his power grew from ancient soil. Their race against time carried them across Europe. They crossed seas in cold wind, raced across plains under gray skies, and rode horses through forests that felt too quiet to be alive. Mina grew paler with each passing day. Sometimes she collapsed without warning. Sometimes she clutched Van Helsing's arm and whispered that she felt Dracula's joy or his anger or the rhythm of the river he traveled beside. But every time she opened her eyes, she forced a faint smile and whispered that she was not giving up, not while they still believed in her. On the river, Jonathan saw a glimpse of a boat carrying a large crate. His heart surged with hope and fear. They followed it for hours, pushing their bodies beyond exhaustion, refusing to lose sight of it. When night fell, they split into groups to cut off every possible route. The cold bit into their skin, their hands stiff, their eyes burning from lack of sleep. But they did not stop, not when they thought of Lucy, not when they looked at Mina fighting her own battle from within. As they approached the Carpathian Mountains, Mina's visions grew sharper. She whispered that she felt him, close, restless, afraid. For the first time, Dracula sensed he was the hunted one, and as the wind howled through the mountain pass and snow began to fall, the group understood the truth that kept them moving, even when their strength was gone. This was not just a chase, it was their final chance, their last hope to save Mina, their last chance to end the nightmare before darkness reached the place where it would become unstoppable. As the group pushed deeper into the Carpathian Mountains, the air grew colder and thinner, and every sound echoed like a warning from the ancient land. Mina's steps weakened, but she kept moving, holding Van Helsing's arm, and whispering that she felt Dracula growing stronger the closer they came to his home. Van Helsing knew the truth. Once Dracula reached his castle, the darkness around him would rise like a shield, and their window to save Mina would close forever. At the foot of the mountain, Van Helsing made a painful decision. He asked Mina to stay inside a small, abandoned chapel while he went ahead. She looked terrified. Clutching his coat like a frightened child, but he stroked her hair gently and promised he would return. He told her she must stay in the chapel because light still lived there, and that light was her only protection against the hunger trying to take her mind. When he entered the old ruins of Dracula's domain, the shadows felt alive. They moved along the walls as if welcoming him. The wind carried whispers in a language older than the stones beneath his feet. In the center of a moonlit clearing, he saw them, the brides, pale, beautiful, terrifying. They circled him with slow, graceful steps, their voices soft like lullabies, meant to pull a man into death. But Van Helsing did not falter. He raised the sacred symbols he carried and prayed with every breath he had. The brides let out cries that shook the forest, their beauty twisting into something monstrous as the light touched them. They fled back into the shadows, but Van Helsing followed, his heart pounding, his courage fueled by the thought of Mina's trembling hands and Lucy's lost smile. One by one he destroyed the brides, giving peace to the cursed souls trapped inside their bodies. When the last scream faded, silence returned to the forest. Van Helsing fell to his knees, exhausted yet filled with a painful hope. He whispered that the darkness had lost part of its power. He whispered that Mina still had a chance. And as he rose again, breathing hard in the frozen air, he looked toward the castle and knew the final battle was waiting. The final chase brought them to the edge of the mountains, just as the sun began to sink behind the snow-covered peaks. The air was sharp and cold, cutting into their lungs with every breath. Mina stood shivering beside Jonathan, her eyes half open, fighting the strange pull inside her chest that told her Dracula was close. Van Helsing returned from the forest exhausted and pale, but there was fire in his voice as he urged them forward. He said they had only moments before Dracula reached the safety of his castle. Once he touched the soil of his homeland, under the cover of night, he would rise stronger than ever, and Mina's soul would be tied to him beyond saving. They pushed on, their boots sinking into the frozen earth, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. Down the narrow road below them, they finally saw it. A wagon racing through the last stretch of daylight, driven by fierce, scrawny men guarding a large wooden box. Dracula was inside, resting, waiting for the night to lift him back into strength. Jonathan felt a surge of terror and rage, the memory of Dracula holding Mina in his arms, burning inside him like a wound that would never heal. Quincy Morris gripped his knife tighter. He whispered a prayer under his breath, then charged down the hill with a fearless determination that made the others follow. The Scani fought like men possessed, swinging blades, blocking the path, shouting in a language thick with fury, but the hunters pushed through them. Jonathan moved with a desperation born from love, fueled by the image of Mina trembling in his arms. Arthur fought for Lucy, his strikes driven by grief and loyalty. Quincy fought with the heart of a man who knew this might be his final act. As they reached the wagon, the last rays of the sun were dying on the horizon. The light fell across the wooden box, and Jonathan knew there was no time left. He forced the lid open. Inside lay Dracula, pale and still, not dead, but sleeping like a creature waiting to rise again. Even in that state, his presence was suffocating. His lips curled into the faintest smile as if he sensed their fear. Jonathan did not hesitate. With a cry ripped from the deepest part of his chest, he raised his blade and struck downward. At the same moment, Quincy drove his knife into Dracula's heart. A roar of pain burst from the box, shaking the air like a storm breaking open. Dracula's body convulsed, his eyes snapping open with a flash of hatred and disbelief. Then his form began to crumble, folding in on itself, turning to dust that scattered into the cold wind. The darkness that had held their world hostage dissolved in moments. Mina gasped as if a heavy chain had shattered inside her. She pressed her hand to her heart, tears spilling from her eyes, whispering that she felt free, truly free. Jonathan gathered her into his arms, his voice breaking with relief. But as the dust settled, they realized Quincy had fallen. A deep wound stained the snow beside him. He smiled weakly at Mina and Jonathan, proud and peaceful, even as his breath grew thin. He whispered that it had been worth it, every step, every sacrifice. They held him as the final light of day faded, knowing he had saved them all. And as the night closed around the mountains, the hunters finally understood what victory had cost. But they also understood something far greater. The darkness had been ended. Mina was safe, and Dracula was gone forever. 7 years passed, and the world slowly learned how to breathe again. Mina and Jonathan built a quiet life far from the shadows that once hunted them. Their home was warm, filled with sunlight, filled with gentle laughter that felt like healing. In Mina's arms they held a son, a boy with bright eyes and a calm spirit. They named him Quincy, in honor of the man whose courage had saved them all. Sometimes when the wind moved through the trees, Jonathan would remember the mountains, the cold, the fear, and the moment Dracula turned to dust. And Mina would reach for his hand, grounding him, reminding him that darkness does not get the final word. Together, they kept the old journals locked in a wooden chest. Jonathan's notes, Mina's typed pages, Van Helsing's letters, Dr. Seward's recordings, a record of everything they had witnessed. A record of how close they had come to losing their world. They never opened the chest lightly. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder of Lucy's smile, of Quincy's sacrifice, of the strength ordinary people can find when love is stronger than fear. One evening, as Mina watched their son sleep, she whispered that evil can rise anywhere, in any age, but so can courage. And as long as people choose to stand together, even the deepest darkness can be defeated. Jonathan smiled softly, closing the chest for the last time. The nightmare had ended. The record was complete. And their lives, at last, belonged to the light again.